Well, we continue to get more reaction to the death of former President FW de Klerk. To talk more about his legacy, we're joined now by Christi van der Westhuizen from the Centre for the Advancement of Non-Racialism and Democracy. Christi, thank you for your time and good morning to you. I mean, I think oftentimes during this period after the announcement of the passing of FW de Klerk, we talk more about legacy. I want to, go back a bit in terms of his upbringing and his relationship with the National Party, also knowing that his father served in cabinet under 3 prime ministers under the apartheid regime. Now, what do you make of FW de Klerk's political career?
Thank you, Tumelo. Very good to join you this morning and the viewers. Yes, the fact is, if you look at FW de Klerk, he comes from a long lineage of National Party leaders. He was thoroughly inculcated into the ideology of Afrikaner nationalism from a very young age. We can see that his dad was Jan de Klerk, who was a senator during the apartheid regime, who served under 3 apartheid prime ministers. His uncle was the hardliner J.G. Strydom, who was the 2nd prime minister in the mid-1950s after D.F. Malan. And this is the environment in which he grew up. He went through a plethora of Afrikaner nationalist organizations as well from a young age, and eventually also joining the Broederbond, which, as we know, was the male secret society that played a large role in determining apartheid policies and approaches. And that's where he comes from. And he was always, so it's interesting to also note that he was seen as a member of the conservative wing of the National Party. P.W. Botha, his predecessor, was seen as an apartheid reformist, but also a securocrat. While de Klerk wasn't actually seen as part of his inner circle. So I think from that point of view, people were very surprised when he made the famous 2nd of February 1990 speech where he unbanned the liberation movements.
Right. Just talking more about then his role as Minister of Education, this between 1984 and 1989. What role did he play there when we look at Bantu education, one of apartheid's ideologies in terms of, shaping then the education system during that time?
Yes, so he served in a number of ministerial portfolios from the late 1970s. Also as Minister of Interior and, as you say, Minister of Education. And as we know that, so under his authority fell the system of Bantu education, which was designed to ensure that black people's life opportunities get limited by having a substandard level of education. And for that, I think that is probably one of the most important aspects of his legacy that shows you actually where he's coming from and how much he was actually really part and parcel of that apartheid system and also upholding it. But interestingly, for example, as Minister of the Interior, he oversaw the repeal of the Mixed Marriages Act. And this is, of course, part of the apartheid reformism that P.W. Botha was instituting during the course of the 1980s. And one thing about de Klerk is that he was definitely a very loyal party member. So he was following party policy. And in that sense, one could also read the transition that he also facilitated as leader of the National Party and the State President of South Africa at the time. Also, actually, as him taking the next step in National Party policy and Broederbond policy at the time, rather than him simply acting on a personal initiative or because of a Damascene kind of conversion. Although it's interesting in his video that was released after his death, he talks about a conversion and he traces it back to the early 1980s, but it is quite difficult to really see that in his actions up until the late 1980s.
Yeah, and I wanted to talk more about that because, I wanted to reflect on some of his, statements at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, about crimes against humanity. And I want to quote him here. He said that the crimes against humanity have to do with the willful extermination of hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of people, that white people, in contrast, had increasingly shared state resources with black people in latter years of apartheid. Christi, my question to you is 20 years plus later, did FW de Klerk's stance and ideologies, had they changed regarding this, or were they the same? Did they remain the same 20 years later?
Well, he sounded pretty much as though he stuck to his guns in terms of what he'd said to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the late 1990s, so that he still believed that while apartheid eventually turned sort of rather that apartheid had unintended consequences. So his position was that apartheid was undertaken with good intentions. And then it basically, produced a system of massive racial injustice and socioeconomic injustice and so forth. Yeah. And of course, we know that's not true, because if you willfully exclude the majority of a population from the resources of the country, then obviously it will have all of these nefarious effects that apartheid has had. But that he stuck to his guns on that. I think part of his argument at the time was also that he was unaware of the state security abuses, the covert operations and so on undertaken by the apartheid regime to stay in power. And there's that, the jury is out on that. The TLC didn't believe him at the time. So it's sort of interesting that somebody who said, I was unaware of the state security abuses and the state violence and the extent of it, at the same time was insistent that it was not a crime against humanity, and he stuck to that position. Even last year, there was a statement from the FW de Klerk Foundation where he again repeated that he believes that it was Soviet Union and ANC agitprop, as he called it, a propaganda, basically. But now, interestingly, again, in this video released after his death, he says he wants to clarify. And I must say, in that moment when he speaks on the video, I do think that just from an affective level, as we would say in academia, from an emotional, psychological level, it does seem as though there's quite he's having an emotional response, and it's definitely more than I've ever seen him. And last night, Mosibudi Mangena from the Azapu was saying he definitely went much, much further than ever before in that video. Right. So it might be that he actually did some further reflection towards the end of his life and really realized the absolutely brutal dehumanization that apartheid wrought in black people's lives.
Do you think you could have done more as part of our viewer question, which we're posing to our viewers this morning, Christi? And I mean, I've seen so many opinions already about this on social media just yesterday after the announcement. But from your perspective, do you think he could have done more, especially post-apartheid, to show a lot more remorse? The video that we saw after the announcement of his passing, should that have happened way earlier, where he addresses these concerns, also even engaging, not just recording a video, but having conversations, taking questions, accounting, taking more accountability and be more transparent about what happened? Do you think that opportunity should have been presented to him? He should have taken it, and perhaps he didn't use much of that opportunity?
Look, it did provide a limited apology for apartheid, very much along the lines as I described earlier, that apartheid in a sense went wrong. It was unintended. That it would have gone wrong as it did, which of course is a horrific euphemism, to say the least. So, but I do. For me, he was really, in terms of the early 1990s, he was the best leader that the National Party at that point could have had, because of his coming from the conservative side. He could really take most Afrikaners and English-speaking whites with him in terms of making the changes, and that's why he had that positive outcome in the 1992 referendum, supporting the negotiations and so on. So he was the right leader at the right time, but he did go where Botha could not go. But in the late, you see that towards the late 1990s, things started to change. And it would seem as though he becomes more and more defensive, and I think it's particularly around the TLC exposure at the time. Many people criticize the TLC, and of course one can't criticize the TLC for many things, but the fact of the matter is the TLC did help us to try and make sense of the horrific brutalities committed to keep apartheid in place. And if you look at the National Party's response and de Klerk's response, it's clear that they were also from their side suddenly, caught out.
Right.
And that made him very defensive. And I think that that unfortunately he stuck to that defensive position for a long period of time. But I should just point out that while most South Africans feel that he didn't go far enough, he didn't do enough, and so on, there's a sizable group of Afrikaners who feels that he actually betrayed Afrikaners because so-called he capitulated without defeat. And of course, the National Party did have state power at the beginning of the 1990s, and they could have held on to it. In fact, that was PW Botha's plan. It's very clear in terms of the trajectory of the Botha regime, that he was going to militarize South African society more and more, try and clamp down more and more to keep a white supremacist state intact until they could kind of create a transition that would allow for kind of special protections for white people and special privileges for white people. And the fact is, de Klerk was able to take that step, which Botha couldn't. And I think he should definitely he deserves credit for that. And also, in spite of what many Afrikaners are saying, it's on social media, it's raging at the moment.
All right,
betrayed us, you gave us power, etc.
All right, we'll have to leave it there due to time, but I appreciate your input and contribution to this conversation. Christi van der Westhuizen, Centre for the Advancement of Non-Racialism and Democracy. Thank you so much for your time this morning.